The new year arrived without announcements. No speeches, no promises, no performative hope. For the first time in a long time, the family stepped into January without pretending that everything was still fixable, and that quiet honesty changed the tone immediately. For viewers of Sister Wives, this shift felt subtle but unmistakable. Something was missing. Not a person, not a tradition, but an expectation. The expectation that everyone would keep trying, keep explaining, keep enduring for the sake of a structure that had already stopped working. That expectation didn't survive the new year. What made this moment different wasn't conflict, it was clarity, the kind that settles in after years of emotional effort finally run out. No one announced that pretending was over. They simply stopped doing it. And that's how real change begins. In past years, January had always carried pressure, a sense that a reset was required, that resolutions could undo damage, that time itself would soften what words and actions had failed to repair. The family leaned on that belief again and again, hoping the calendar would do emotional work for them. This year, no one leaned. They stood where they were. The pretending that ended wasn't about happiness, it was about alignment, about no longer saying we're fine when no one felt fine, about no longer showing up to moments already knowing how they would feel and still forcing themselves through them. Pretending is exhausting, and exhaustion eventually demands honesty. That honesty showed up quietly, in the way conversations shortened, in the way explanations stopped, in the way people made choices without checking whether they would upset someone else first. That's not cruelty. That's self-respect. Christine embodied this shift most clearly, not by rejecting the past, but by refusing to carry it forward. She didn't enter the new year angry. She entered it resolved. The difference matters. Anger still asks for engagement. Resolution does not. Her energy wasn't loud or triumphant. It was grounded, calm, certain. She no longer shaped her days around emotional fallout. She didn't rehearse conversations in advance. She didn't anticipate reactions. She lived. That was new. For years, emotional labor had been her default, explaining, soothing, adjusting, shrinking. The new year arrived, and she didn't pack those habits with her, not because she was trying to prove anything, but because she no longer needed them. Others felt that change immediately. The family dynamic shifted from reactive to neutral, not warm, not hostile, neutral. And neutrality after prolonged tension can feel like freedom. No one was walking on eggshells. No one was bracing for conflict. There was nothing left to brace for. Kody experienced this shift differently. For him, the lack of reaction was unsettling. In the past, even disagreement meant engagement. Even frustration meant connection. Now responses were polite but distant. Conversations ended without emotional closure, because closure had already happened internally. That's when it became clear. Pretending had ended on both sides, but not at the same time. The family had reached this point slowly. Kody was arriving later. That mismatch created silence where arguments used to be. Silence that didn't beg to be filled. Silence that simply existed. This wasn't avoidance. It was completion. The new year didn't bring a reset because no one was asking for one. Resets imply returning to something. The family wasn't interested in returning. They were interested in continuing, separately, honestly, and without performance. That honesty stripped away old roles. The peacemaker, the authority, the negotiator. Those roles only function when people agree to play them. Once pretending ends, the roles dissolve naturally. And when roles dissolve, identity changes. This is why the shift felt so profound without being dramatic. Nothing exploded, nothing collapsed. The family didn't fall apart. They stood still long enough to see what was already gone. Viewers sensed this immediately. The absence of drama wasn't boring, it was revealing. It showed how much of the past tension had been sustained by obligation rather than desire. Once obligation disappeared, so did the tension. What replaced it wasn't joy, it was peace. Peace isn't exciting television. It doesn't shout, it doesn't demand attention, but it holds. And when people tasted after years of strain, they protected fiercely. That's what this new year represented. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, not renewal. Truth. Truth about limits, truth about capacity, truth about what could no longer be carried. Pretending often masquerades as hope, but hope without evidence becomes pressure, and pressure, sustained long enough, turns into resentment. This family chose not to carry that resentment into another year. They didn't announce it, they demonstrated it.
Through smaller gatherings, through quieter days, through decisions that didn't need consensus. The future, for the first time, wasn't being imagined collectively. And instead of panic, that realization brought relief, because imagining together had become a burden, not a dream. This new year didn't ask anyone to try harder. It asked them to be honest. And honesty, once practiced, doesn't feel like loss. It feels like relief. This was the beginning of a year without pretending, not because everything was resolved, but because nothing was being disguised anymore. And once pretending ends, there's no reason to go back. For a long time, pretending wasn't a choice. It was survival. In the early years, pretending looked like optimism, like believing that effort would eventually be rewarded, like trusting that patience, compromise, and sacrifice would add up to something stable. No one called it pretending then. It was framed as commitment, as loyalty, as doing the hard work required to keep a complicated family intact. And for a while, that framing worked. Pretending only becomes visible in hindsight, when you realize how much energy it required just to maintain the appearance of togetherness. When you look back and see how often emotions were swallowed, needs were postponed, and discomfort was normalized in the name of making it work. That normalization was gradual. Small disappointments were explained away. Big ones were softened. Patterns that caused pain were reframed as misunderstandings. And each time that happened, pretending became easier. Not because it hurt less, but because it felt necessary. This is how survival habits form. In families like the one viewers watched on Sister Wives, survival was praised. Endurance was treated as virtue. Staying was celebrated more than thriving. And over time, that message shaped behavior in subtle but powerful ways. You stop asking for more because you don't want to seem ungrateful. You stop pushing back because conflict feels destabilizing. You stop trusting your instincts because you're told they're the problem. That's not weakness, that's adaptation. Christine adapted for years, not by shutting down, but by giving more. More patience, more understanding, more emotional labor. She believed that if she carried enough of the weight, the structure would eventually feel balanced. But imbalance doesn't correct itself. It deepens. Every time she explained her pain instead of being met with change, something shifted, not outwardly, internally. Hope didn't disappear all at once. It thinned. It became conditional. It required more effort to maintain than it returned. That's when pretending stops being hopeful and starts being costly. Others in the family experienced this in different ways, but the pattern was similar. Survival meant adjusting expectations downward, accepting less connection, normalizing distance, telling yourself this was just how things were. Survival requires justification, and for a long time, those justifications held, but survival has a limit. That limit arrives when the cost of pretending outweighs the cost of honesty, when staying silent hurts more than speaking up, when carrying the structure feels heavier than letting it go. The new year arrived right after that tipping point. By then, pretending wasn't protecting anyone anymore. It wasn't maintaining peace. It wasn't preventing harm. It was simply delaying the inevitable and draining the people carrying it. That's why the shift felt so calm. The fight had already happened internally. When people stop pretending, it doesn't always look dramatic. Often it looks like relief, like exhaling after holding your breath for too long, like realizing you don't actually have to keep doing something just because you always have. Christine reached that realization quietly. She didn't announce it. She didn't demand recognition for it. She simply stopped participating in patterns that required her to disappear in order to function. That wasn't rebellion. It was self-respect. Self-respect doesn't argue its case. It changes behavior. Once that change happened, pretending became impossible to sustain. Not just for her, but for everyone. Because pretending relies on mutual participation. One person stepping out exposes the truth of the system. And the truth was this: survival had replaced connection a long time ago. Kody hadn't seen it that way. From his perspective, survival meant persistence. If the family was still intact, then the system was still working. Conflict was interpreted as friction, not failure. As long as people were reacting, he believed engagement still existed. What he didn't account for was emotional exhaustion. Exhaustion doesn't argue. It doesn't escalate. It disengages. By the time the new year arrived, exhaustion had done its work.
The family didn't need to confront pretending anymore, because pretending had already collapsed under its own weight. No one was trying to expose anything. They were responding to what they could no longer carry. This is why survival gave way to self-respect without a dramatic transition. Self-respect doesn't need to announce itself. It simply stops agreeing to terms that cause harm. Once that happens, the old rules lose authority. The family didn't stop caring. They stopped compensating. And compensation had been the glue holding everything together. Viewers could sense this shift, even if they didn't label it right away. The tone changed. Conversations felt less strained. The urgency to fix things disappeared. Not because problems vanished, but because pretending they could be fixed no longer felt honest. Honesty can feel abrupt when you're used to endurance, but endurance isn't neutral. It costs something. And when people realize the cost exceeds the benefit, they don't explode. They opt out. That's what this new year represented. Not an escape, not a rejection of the past, a recognition of limits. Pretending had served its purpose. It had kept the family together longer than it otherwise might have, but it had also delayed growth, clarity, and peace. Letting it go wasn't failure. It was evolution. And once survival gives way to self-respect, there's no incentive to return to pretending, because pretending requires denying what you now understand. This was the point of no return. The family wasn't choosing conflict over peace. They were choosing truth over performance, and that choice didn't need validation to stand. It simply changed everything that followed.
Once pretending stopped, daily life had to reorganize around something else: truth. Not the dramatic kind that demands confrontation, but the practical kind that changes how people move through their days. Without pretending, routines couldn't rely on emotional shortcuts anymore. They had to reflect what people actually felt, not what they wished they felt. That adjustment was immediate. Mornings became simpler, plans became smaller, conversations became shorter. Not because people were avoiding each other, but because there was no longer a need to pad reality with reassurance. Decisions didn't require emotional consensus, they required honesty. And honesty streamlined everything. In the past, daily life had been shaped by anticipation. Who might be upset? What reaction needed to be managed? How much explanation would be required to make a simple choice feel acceptable? That constant calculation had become invisible over time, but it consumed enormous energy. Without pretending, that calculation disappeared. Christine noticed this first. Her days felt lighter not because she was happier every moment, but because she wasn't bracing herself anymore. She didn't wake up preparing to justify her feelings. She didn't end the day replaying conversations to see what she should have said differently. She trusted herself. That changed how she spoke, how she listened, and how she chose. She said yes when it felt right. She said no when it didn't, and she didn't soften either response. Not out of defiance, out of alignment. Others adjusted in quieter ways. Communication shifted from emotional processing to logistics. Messages focused on times, places, and needs rather than feelings. When emotions surfaced, they were acknowledged briefly instead of unpacked endlessly. That wasn't avoidance. It was discernment. Not every feeling needed to be processed together anymore. Not every discomfort required group attention. People were allowed to hold their own emotions without assigning them to someone else. That alone reduced tension dramatically. For Kody, this change felt disorienting. He was used to emotional engagement being constant, even if it was uncomfortable. Discussion had been the currency of connection. Now, discussion was optional. When he spoke, people listened politely, but they didn't rearrange themselves around his words. When he expressed frustration, it didn't ripple outward. It landed and stayed where it was. That was new. The family no longer mirrored his emotional state. They didn't escalate or soothe. They allowed him to have his feelings without taking responsibility for them. That boundary was subtle but firm. Children adapted quickly to the new rhythm. They noticed the difference not in what was said, but in what wasn't. Fewer tense pauses, fewer emotional undercurrents, fewer moments where adults seemed distracted by unspoken conflict. The house felt steadier. Steadiness doesn't eliminate sadness, but it makes sadness manageable. It allows space for ordinary life to resume. Meals, routines, small joys that had been overshadowed by emotional negotiation. Without pretending, life regained texture. Laughter wasn't followed by guilt. Quiet wasn't interpreted as a problem. People occupied the same spaces without monitoring each other's moods. That coexistence felt different from forced togetherness. It felt voluntary. This shift also changed how time was experienced. Days didn't feel stretched thin by unresolved tension. Weeks passed without the familiar cycle of build-up and release. There was no emotional countdown to the next conversation that might fix things. Nothing needed fixing anymore. Viewers of Sister Wives could feel this even through the screen. Scenes lingered differently. The camera captured pauses without filling them with commentary. Silence wasn't treated as suspense. It was treated as information. That information was clear. The family had moved into a phase where honesty governed behavior more than hope, and honesty, while less dramatic, is far more stable. The absence of pretending also clarified boundaries. People stopped volunteering emotional labor by default. Support was offered when requested, not assumed. That distinction prevented resentment from accumulating. When support is chosen, it feels generous. When it's assumed, it feels owed. The new year erased that sense of debt. Daily life also revealed how much pretending had masked fatigue. Once it stopped, energy returned in small but noticeable ways. People were more present, less reactive, more capable of enjoying moments without scanning for tension. That energy didn't come from happiness. It came from relief. Relief that they didn't have to keep a story going that no longer matched their experience. This relief didn't erase grief. There were still moments of sadness, nostalgia, and loss, but those emotions weren't amplified by denial.
They were allowed to exist without being solved. Grief without pretending moves differently. It comes and goes. It doesn't dominate,
It doesn't demand action. That allowed healing to begin organically. The family wasn't healing toward reunion, they were healing toward self-trust, and that direction mattered. Healing aimed at reunion keeps people tied to the past. Healing aimed at self-trust prepares them for the future. This is why daily life changed so quickly once pretending ended. The effort required to maintain appearances had been enormous. Removing it freed up capacity for living. By the end of this phase, the new routines didn't feel temporary. They felt normal. And normality, once established, is resistant to disruption. No one was asking how long this would last. They were living as if it would. That assumption marked the true turning point. When people stop waiting for things to change back, they begin building something that can last. The family wasn't trying to prove anything. They were practicing honesty. And honesty, practiced daily, reshapes everything from the inside out. As honesty settled into daily life, something deeper surfaced: finality. Not the dramatic kind that announces itself with ultimatums, but the quiet kind that arrives when people realize they're no longer waiting for things to change. Pretending had ended, and with it, the expectation that time or effort would somehow return the family to an earlier version of itself. This realization didn't land all at once. It arrived in moments. Moments when conversations ended without circling back, when decisions were made without follow-up texts, when weeks passed without anyone asking, "Are we okay?" Because the answer no longer mattered in the same way. Finality doesn't feel sharp at first. It feels calm. Christine experienced this calm as certainty. Not certainty about every future outcome, but certainty about one thing: she wasn't going back. The energy she once spent managing reactions, anticipating conflict, and cushioning truth had been reclaimed. And once reclaimed, it didn't feel optional to give it away again. That certainty didn't require defense. She didn't explain it. She didn't negotiate it. She lived it. Others felt the same certainty differently. For some, it showed up as relief mixed with sadness. For others, it showed up as emotional neutrality, no longer charged by hope or disappointment. But everyone shared the same understanding. Pretending was not coming back. And that understanding changed how boundaries functioned. Boundaries used to be porous, tested repeatedly by expectation and guilt. Now they were quiet and firm. They didn't announce themselves. They were simply observed. People didn't push against them because there was nothing to gain from doing so. That's how you know a boundary is real. It doesn't invite argument. For Kody, this phase was the most difficult to accept. The family wasn't pushing him away, but they also weren't pulling him in. That middle space, where presence is allowed but influence is not, was unfamiliar and uncomfortable. He had been central for so long that absence of reaction felt like rejection. But it wasn't rejection. It was resolution. Resolution meant his emotions were no longer the organizing principle of the family. His frustration didn't redirect plans. His disappointment didn't slow decisions. His explanations didn't reopen conversations that had already closed. That loss of leverage forced a painful adjustment. Because leverage often masquerades as love when people are used to it. Without leverage, relationships must stand on mutual desire alone, and mutual desire can't be forced. This is where finality took root. Not in a fight, not in a declaration, in the steady refusal to renegotiate settled decisions. The family wasn't withholding warmth to punish anyone. They were protecting the stability they had found. Stability required consistency, and consistency required boundaries that didn't bend under pressure. Viewers of Sister Wives could feel this shift even when scenes were quiet. The absence of emotional escalation was the message. No one was building toward a reveal or bracing for fallout. Life unfolded as if the question of what happens next had already been answered. Because it had. The family had reached a place where the past no longer competed with the present. Old arguments didn't resurface because they no longer served a purpose. Revisiting them wouldn't leave to repair. It would only reopen wounds that had finally closed. So they stayed closed. This didn't mean there was no grief. Grief moved underneath the surface, surfacing in unexpected ways. A memory, a habit that no longer applied. A moment when the old reflex to explain kicked in and was consciously released. Grief without pretending is cleaner. It doesn't demand solutions. It doesn't look for villains. It allows itself to pass.
And as it passed, something else replaced it. Trust in the present. Trust that the calm wasn't temporary. Trust that the boundaries would hold. Trust that life without pretending was sustainable. That trust is what made this phase irreversible. People don't return to endurance once they've tasted alignment. They don't volunteer for emotional labor once they realized it was optional. They don't pretend to feel something they don't in order to keep a structure alive. Structures survive on participation, and participation had changed. The family still interacted, but the terms were different. Interactions were chosen, not assumed. Connection was contextual, not compulsory. This reduced resentment and clarified intent. When people showed up, it meant something. When they didn't, it wasn't interpreted as betrayal. That reframing mattered. It allowed relationships to exist without constant evaluation, without asking whether every interaction was progress or setback, without measuring moments against a future that was no longer shared. Finality simplifies the emotional math. There's no more waiting for a turning point because the turning point has passed. There's no more hope to manage because hope has been replaced by clarity. There's no more pretending to protect because there's nothing left to protect. What remains is choice. Choice about where to invest energy, choice about which relationships to nurture, choice about how to live honestly without apology. This is why the new year felt so decisive. Not because something dramatic ended, but because nothing needed to be reopened. The family didn't need a formal goodbye to know they were in a different chapter. They were living it, and living it consistently. By the end of this phase, the idea of returning to the old dynamic felt distant, almost theoretical, like considering a path you once walked and knowing your body would resist going back. Not out of fear, out of growth. This growth wasn't flashy. It didn't announce itself on camera, but it showed up in posture, in pacing, in the ease of ordinary moments. It showed up in the lack of urgency, the absence of tension, the steadiness of routine. Finality doesn't look like collapse. It looks like peace that doesn't need permission. And once that peace settles in, pretending has no place left to land.
Once finality settled in, its effects didn't stay contained within the immediate family. They moved outward, reshaping every relationship connected to it. Friends noticed first. Conversations felt different. There was less emotional filtering, less careful phrasing meant to avoid conflict. Invitations were accepted or declined without elaborate explanations. Time was spent where it felt mutual, not obligatory. That change wasn't announced, it was felt. When pretending ends inside a family, it inevitably ends everywhere else too. You stop performing in one space, and suddenly performance feels unnecessary in all of them. Relationships that depended on emotional overextension quietly faded. Ones built on reciprocity grew stronger. This wasn't rejection, it was alignment. Christine's friendship shifted in ways that surprised even her. Without the constant pull of family stress, she showed up more fully. She listened without distraction. She laughed without scanning the room for tension. Her presence felt lighter, and others responded to that ease. The difference wasn't confidence, it was availability. Emotional availability returns when it's no longer being drained elsewhere. Parenting changed too. Without pretending, parenting became more grounded. Decisions were made with clarity instead of compromise. Boundaries were set without guilt. Children sensed the difference immediately, even if they couldn't articulate it. They felt safer. Not because everything was perfect, but because emotional rules were consistent. Adults weren't oscillating between hope and disappointment. Moons weren't dictated by unresolved conflict. The environment stabilized, and children relaxed into it. That relaxation mattered. It showed how much tension had been absorbed silently before. Without pretending, parenting became less reactive. There was more patience, not because stress disappeared, but because it wasn't compounded by denial. Problems were addressed directly instead of being layered with emotional subtext. Directness simplified everything. For Kody, watching these shifts from the outside was painful in a new way. The family wasn't unraveling. It wasn't struggling publicly. It was functioning, just not around him. That reality forced a reckoning with something he had avoided for years. Influence had limits, and those limits had been reached. He tried at times to reinsert himself through familiar means, shared history, reminders of effort, references to the past. But the past no longer held authority. It provided context, not permission. When pretending ends, nostalgia loses its leverage. The family wasn't erasing history. They simply weren't living in it anymore. Decisions were made based on present capacity, not past sacrifice. That shift closed a door that nostalgia had kept crack open. Viewers of Sister Wives could feel this clearly. The story wasn't escalating toward confrontation. It was widening into independence. The camera captured people living instead of processing. That change challenged expectations. Reality TV often relies on conflict to create momentum. This phase relied on consistency. Week after week, the same boundaries held. The same tone persisted. The absence of volatility became the point. Consistency is convincing. As relationships beyond the family adjusted, a pattern emerged. People responded to honesty with respect. Not everyone liked it, not everyone stayed, but the relationships that remained felt sturdier, more grounded. Honesty acted like a filter. It removed what couldn't adapt. That filtering wasn't aggressive. It didn't require confrontation. It simply happened as people aligned themselves with what felt sustainable, and sustainability became the new standard. This standard changed how time was valued. Energy wasn't spent maintaining appearances. It was invested in experiences that felt restorative. The calendar filled differently. Fewer obligations, more intention. Intentionality is what replaces pretending. Intentionality doesn't ask, what should I do to keep the peace? It asks, what can I do that won't cost me myself? That question guided choices now. For the family, this meant fewer group moments and more meaningful individual ones. Togetherness wasn't abandoned, but it was redefined. It happened when it made sense, not when it was expected. Expectation had been the engine of pretending.
Once expectation lost its authority, pretending had nowhere to stand. This redefinition also changed how conflict was interpreted. Disagreements didn't feel threatening because they weren't tied to a shared future that needed protection. People could disagree without fearing collapse. That freedom reduced defensiveness. When you're not trying to preserve a fragile structure, you don't argue as desperately. You don't cling to being right. You choose what matters and let the rest go. That choice was visible everywhere, in quieter conversations.
In easier goodbyes and the absence of emotional bargaining. By now, the year without pretending had established its own rhythm. The early uncertainty was gone. What remained was a sense of groundedness that didn't depend on agreement. This groundedness reframed the past. What once felt like failure now looked like transition. What once felt like abandonment now looked like release. The narrative shifted from loss to completion. Completion doesn't erase pain. It gives it a place. The family wasn't celebrating the end of pretending. They were benefiting from it. And benefit, when sustained, doesn't require justification. That's why this phase felt so solid. No one was asking if it was the right decision anymore. The decision had proven itself through lived experience. Life was calmer, relationships were clearer, energy was conserved. Pretending, by contrast, now felt unthinkable. Once you experience honesty without punishment, performance feels unnecessary. Once you live without emotional debt, obligation feels optional. This was the quiet transformation happening beneath the surface. And it mattered more than any dramatic scene ever could. As the year continued, the most significant change wasn't external at all. It was internal. Without pretending, self-image began to shift in ways that couldn't be undone. When people stop performing for approval, they're forced to confront who they actually are without the roles they've been playing. That confrontation can be uncomfortable, but it's also clarifying. For Christine, this meant redefining herself outside of endurance. For years, strength had been measured by how much she could tolerate, by how long she could stay hopeful, by how well she could absorb disappointment without letting it show. That definition no longer applied. Strength became quieter. It looked like discernment, like choosing where to invest energy and where not to, like trusting her own read of situations instead of waiting for confirmation from someone else. She didn't call this empowerment, she called it normal. And that normalization mattered. When self-respect becomes normal, it stops feeling like rebellion. It becomes the baseline. You no longer need to explain why you won't do something that hurts you. You simply don't do it. That internal shift radiated outward. Christine spoke differently. Not sharper, just clearer. Her tone didn't carry apology. Her pauses didn't signal uncertainty. She wasn't bracing for pushback because she wasn't offering herself up for debate. Others felt that steadiness and adjusted accordingly. Identity, once stabilized, becomes a boundary on its own. For the rest of the family, similar shifts unfolded at different speeds. Some grappled with guilt, the reflexive sense that choosing themselves meant abandoning someone else. Others struggled with the absence of instruction. Without pretending, there was no script to follow, no role to default to. That freedom can feel unsettling before it feels empowering. But over time, each person discovered something important. They could make decisions without betraying themselves or anyone else. They could say no without cruelty. They could step back without disappearing. That realization changed how they saw themselves. In the past, identity had been relational. Who you were depended on how you fit into the family system. Now identity became personal. It wasn't defined by position or expectation, but by values and capacity. This shift reduced internal conflict dramatically. When your actions align with your values, you stop arguing with yourself. You stop replaying conversations. You stop questioning whether you did the right thing. Even hard choices feel steadier when they're honest. That steadiness showed up in unexpected ways. People slept better. They laughed more easily. They made plans without anxiety. None of this was flashy, but it was real. For Kody, this phase was particularly challenging. His identity had been built around being central, the decision maker, the emotional reference point, the person others oriented around. Without pretending, that identity lost its footing. He wasn't being attacked, he was being bypassed. That distinction hurt more than confrontation would have. Confrontation implies relevance, bypass implies completion. As others redefined themselves, he was forced to confront a difficult question. Who am I if no one needs me to hold the system together? That question doesn't have an immediate answer, it lingers. It reshapes posture before it reshapes belief. He became quieter, less reactive, more observational. Not because he had resolved everything, but because the space for reaction had closed. That space was now occupied by autonomy. For viewers of Sister Wives, this internal shift was subtle but powerful. The story was no longer about what people wanted from each other. It was about who they were becoming without each other's approval. That change elevated the narrative. It moved the focus from conflict to character. Scenes felt less charged but more revealing. You could see it in posture, in eye contact, and how people entered and exited conversations. No one lingered to manage impressions. They showed up, did what they needed to do, and moved on. That's the behavior of someone who trusts themselves. Trust is the opposite of pretending. Pretending asks, how do I need to act to keep this together? Trust asks, what do I know to be true for me right now? The family had shifted from the first question to the second. This shift also changed how mistakes were handled. Without pretending, there was less defensiveness. People could acknowledge missteps without spiraling into shame. They could adjust without framing it as failure. Because the goal wasn't to preserve an image anymore. It was to live honestly. That honesty softened interactions in unexpected ways. Without the pressure to perform unity, kindness felt easier. People didn't need to prove anything. They didn't need to win conversations or score points. They needed peace, and peace became the metric. The most telling sign of this phase was how little it needed reinforcement. No one announced new rules. No one reminded others of boundaries. The changes held on their own because they were rooted internally. Internal change doesn't require policing. It sustains itself. By now, the year without pretending had become a year of alignment. Alignment between values and actions, between needs and boundaries, between identity and behavior. That alignment made the idea of returning to pretending feel impossible. Not dramatic, just wrong. Like wearing clothes that no longer fit your body or your life. Once identity evolves, regression feels unnatural. This is why the shift carried such finality. It wasn't about ending relationships. It was about ending self-betrayal. And once self-betrayal ends, many old dynamics simply can't survive. They require too much denial. The family wasn't rejecting each other. They were accepting themselves. That acceptance redefined everything that followed. Once identity aligned internally, the future began to change shape. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but decisively. For years, the future had been imagined collectively. Even when things were strained, there was still an assumption that plans would eventually converge, that time would realign everyone, that effort would pull the family back into a shared direction. That assumption disappeared, and without it, the future stopped being a group destination. People began planning in smaller frames, shorter timelines, personal goals, decisions that didn't require consensus or emotional buy-in from others. The future became practical instead of symbolic. This wasn't pessimism, it was accuracy. Christine felt this shift most clearly. She no longer imagined outcomes that depended on someone else changing. Her plans didn't leave space for reconciliation or reversal. They assumed continuity where she was, not repair where she had been. That assumption changed everything. When people plan as if their peace is permanent, their choices gain confidence. They stop hedging, they stop leaving doors cracked open just in case. They invest fully in what's in front of them. Christine wasn't closing doors out of anger. She was building something that didn't require looking back. Others in the family followed this pattern differently, but the direction was the same. Futures were imagined independently, not in opposition to each other, but without needing to intersect. Dreams narrowed and sharpened. Expectations became realistic. This realism reduced anxiety. Anxiety thrives on uncertainty and mixed signals. Once pretending ended and identity stabilized, uncertainty lost its grip. People weren't waiting for permission to move forward. They weren't scanning for signs that they should pause. They were proceeding. For Kody, this was the hardest phase to sit with. The future he had imagined, however flawed, was no longer being referenced. Conversations didn't include someday language anymore. There were no long-range plans discussed as a group, no shared milestones being mapped out. The silence around the future was unmistakable. It wasn't hostility, it was exclusion by evolution. When people move forward without you, they aren't necessarily pushing you away. They're responding to what feels viable. And what felt viable now didn't require a shared vision. That realization carried grief. Not the grief of loss through conflict, but the grief of recognizing that the future you imagined expired quietly while you were still hoping it would revive. Hope, when it outlives evidence, becomes a liability. The family had let go of that liability. This shift also changed how the past was remembered. It no longer competed with the future for relevance. Past sacrifices didn't earn future claims. History was acknowledged, but it wasn't leveraged. That's a profound change in family dynamics. When history stops being currency, people are free to make decisions based on present capacity rather than past obligation. That freedom reshapes priorities quickly. Viewers of Sister Wives could sense this recalibration. The narrative stopped teasing what-if scenarios. There were no hints of reunions or last-chance efforts. The story had shifted from possibility to consequence, not punishment. Consequence. Consequence is simply the outcome of sustained choices. The family wasn't choosing separation in the future. They had already chosen honesty in the present. And honesty narrows options. That narrowing wasn't restrictive. It was clarifying. It removed paths that no longer fit. It focused energy on what could actually be built. As a result, the future felt closer, more immediate, more tangible. Instead of distant goals that required emotional alignment, there were near-term plans that required only personal commitment. That made progress visible. People moved, adjusted routines, changed priorities. None of it was framed as rebellion or escape. It was framed as life. Life doesn't wait for consensus. It responds to readiness. This readiness also changed how disappointment was handled. When the future isn't shared, unmet expectations don't carry the same weight. You don't grieve a plan you never made. You don't feel betrayed by an outcome you didn't promise yourself. That emotional protection mattered. It prevented new resentments from forming. It kept the present clean. It allowed people to interact without measuring every moment against a future that wasn't coming. That's when distance stops feeling like loss. It starts feeling like space. Space to choose, space to grow, space to imagine without negotiation. For some, that space was invigorating. For others, it was unsettling. But no one mistook it for temporary anymore. The absence of future talk wasn't a phase. It was a boundary. And boundaries around the future are the hardest to reverse because they aren't emotional. They're logistical.
They change how time is spent, where energy goes, and what people prepare for. Once preparation shifts, momentum follows. The family's momentum now pointed in multiple directions, not chaotically, but independently. And independence, once practiced, becomes preference. This is why the year without pretending felt irreversible. It didn't just change how people felt, it changed how they planned. Planning is commitment in advance, and the commitments being made no longer assumed a shared destination. That doesn't mean the family stopped caring. It means caring stopped requiring convergence. They could wish each other well without coordinating futures. They could coexist without entangling timelines. They could be connected by history without being bound by expectation. That's a different kind of family, one built on consent rather than obligation. As this understanding settled in, the future stopped being a source of tension. It became neutral, open, personal. People weren't anxious about where things were headed because they weren't waiting for alignment anymore. They were aligned with themselves. By now, the year without pretending had settled into something unmistakable: completion. Not closure in the dramatic sense, not a final conversation or a symbolic goodbye. Completion as a lived reality, steady, consistent, and no longer questioned. The family wasn't waiting for clarity anymore. They were living inside it. This is the point where many stories would try to manufacture momentum, a confrontation, a reveal, a last attempt to pull everyone back into the same room. But nothing like that happened here, because nothing needed to. The absence of escalation was the escalation. Weeks passed without emotional spikes. Interactions remained neutral and predictable. Boundaries held without reinforcement. No one tested them. No one tried to renegotiate the terms of connection. That lack of testing told the real story. When people stop testing boundaries, it means they accept them. Acceptance doesn't look dramatic. It looks like consistency. And consistency, repeated long enough, becomes truth. Christine moved through this phase with a quiet assurance that didn't seek confirmation. She wasn't checking to see if her choices were validated. She wasn't monitoring reactions for signs of approval or disapproval. She trusted the life she was building because it was already working. Working doesn't mean perfect. It means sustainable. Sustainability had become the guiding principle for everyone, not excitement, not symbolism, not appearances, just what could be maintained without emotional debt. That principle simplified everything. Decisions became easier because fewer variables mattered. Choices were evaluated based on capacity rather than obligation. Time was spent where it felt reciprocal. Energy was protected instead of overextended. This wasn't selfishness, it was discernment. For Kody, this phase confirmed what he had been resisting. The family wasn't in a holding pattern. They weren't waiting him out. They weren't pausing to see if things might feel different later. They had moved on. Not angrily, not publicly, but definitively. He adjusted accordingly, though not without difficulty. The realization that his emotional responses no longer shaped outcomes required a recalibration of expectations. He wasn't excluded, but he also wasn't central. His presence was contextual, not foundational. That shift brought humility without ceremony. And humility, when it arrives late, often arrives quietly. The rest of the family didn't celebrate this change. There was no sense of victory. There was simply less tension, less internal negotiation, less emotional noise. The relief of not having to manage a fragile system became apparent in ordinary moments. Ordinary moments are where truth lives. They reveal whether a dynamic is healing or merely pausing. And these moments showed that healing wasn't aimed at reunion, it was aimed at stability. Viewers sensed this too. The narrative no longer invited speculation. It didn't tease reversals or hint at secret reconciliations. Instead, it documented a steady present, one that didn't depend on suspense to hold interest. That steadiness reframed everything that came before it. Earlier seasons now read differently. Conflicts that once felt unresolved appeared resolved by outcome rather than conversation. Questions that lingered for years found answers in behavior, not dialogue. Behavior answered what words never could. This reframing allowed the audience to let go of the need for a dramatic ending. They didn't need a final declaration to understand what had happened. The consistency of the present made the past make sense. Completion doesn't always come with satisfaction. Sometimes it comes with relief. Relief that the cycle has stopped. Relief that effort is no longer being poured into something that can't return it.
Relief that honesty has replaced hope, where hope had become heavy. That relief defined this phase. It also clarified something important. Pretending hadn't just delayed the ending, it had distorted the experience of the present. Without pretending, life felt more accurate, less inflated by expectation, less burdened by the idea that something else needed to happen for things to be okay. Things were okay because they were honest. That honesty made room for nuance. People could feel sadness without interpreting it as failure. They could feel nostalgia without wanting to go back. They could care without committing to convergence. Nuance is only possible when pretending ends. Because pretending flattens experience. It forces everything into a single narrative, together or broken, success or failure, hope or despair. Honesty allows multiple truths to coexist. This family lived inside those multiple truths now. Connection existed, but it was lighter. History mattered, but it didn't dictate. The future unfolded, but it wasn't shared, and that was okay. This phase also revealed how endings often happen long before we label them. The label is just a formality. The real ending occurs when behavior stops contradicting reality. Here, behavior had aligned completely. No mixed signals, no contradictory actions, no emotional doublebacks. Alignment held. And when alignment holds long enough, the ending becomes undeniable, not because it's announced, but because nothing pulls against it anymore. The family didn't need to say goodbye to pretending. They had outgrown it. Outgrowing doesn't feel like loss in the moment. It feels like fit, like realizing something you've been carrying no longer belongs to you, like setting it down without ceremony and continuing forward. That's what this year had done. It didn't close a door dramatically. It made the door irrelevant. As this understanding settled, the story reached its natural resting point. There was nothing left to explain, nothing left to justify, nothing left to fix. The family wasn't unfinished. They were complete.
By the time the year reached its later months, something subtle but decisive had happened. No one was checking anymore. No one was checking to see if things might shift back. No one was checking reactions before making plans. No one was checking whether honesty had gone too far. That constant internal monitoring, the last remnant of pretending, had finally stopped. And that's how everyone knew this wasn't a phase. In earlier seasons, even after major conflicts, there was always a sense of waiting for the next conversation, waiting for the next apology, waiting for the moment when things might soften again. That waiting shaped behavior. It kept people emotionally tethered to outcomes they couldn't control. This year, the waiting ended, not because everything was resolved, but because nothing was unresolved in a way that mattered anymore. The family no longer organized itself around potential reconciliation. Choices weren't provisional, plans weren't framed with escape hatches. Decisions were made as if they would stand, and they did. That confidence changed the emotional atmosphere completely. Christine moved through this phase with an ease that felt earned, not forced. She didn't project certainty outward, she embodied it inward. Her life no longer revolved around explaining her position or justifying her needs. She wasn't reacting to anyone else's timeline. She was living on her own. That independence didn't erase sadness, but it gave sadness context. It no longer threatened stability. It passed through without demanding action. Memory surfaced without pulling her backward. She could acknowledge what had been without reopening what had closed. That's the mark of completion. Others in the family reached this place more gradually, but the destination was the same. They stopped measuring progress. They stopped evaluating interactions for meaning. They allowed moments to be just moments, not symbols, not tests, not signals. Life became lighter because it stopped carrying interpretation. For Kody, this stage was unmistakable. The family wasn't responding differently anymore. They were responding consistently. Consistency removes ambiguity. It leaves little room for reinterpretation. There was no longer a question of whether things might change. They already had. He adjusted, slowly, unevenly, but visibly. Not by reclaiming influence, but by recognizing its absence. He spoke less, observed more. The emotional space he once filled had been redistributed, and there was no mechanism to reclaim it. That realization didn't come with confrontation. It came with silence that didn't need filling. Silence can be uncomfortable when you expect engagement, but when silence becomes normal, it stops feeling like rejection. It becomes background. And background is where completed things live. Viewers of Sister Wives felt this too. The story no longer invited emotional speculation. There were no cliffhangers built around family unity, no teases of last chance efforts. The narrative had flattened, not from lack of interest, but from lack of tension. Tension requires opposition. There was none left. The family wasn't pulling in different directions emotionally anymore. They were moving independently, and independence doesn't argue with itself. It doesn't need to be defended. It simply continues. This phase also reframed what togetherness meant. Togetherness was no longer a goal to achieve or a standard to measure against. It existed when it felt right and dissolved when it didn't. There was no moral weight attached to either state. That reframing removed guilt. Guilt had been the fuel of pretending, the belief that wanting distance meant failing someone else. Once that belief dissolved, pretending lost its emotional leverage. Distance became neutral. Neutrality is powerful. It allows relationships to exist without pressure. It allows people to show up without rehearsing. It allows space without interpretation. That neutrality defined the family now. And with neutrality came acceptance. Acceptance that this configuration, looser, quieter, less centralized, was not a temporary adjustment. It was the new structure. Not imposed, not negotiated, but lived. This structure didn't require maintenance meetings. It didn't depend on shared belief. It held because it matched reality. Reality is the strongest glue there is. As months passed, the idea of returning to pretending felt increasingly foreign. Not tempting, not threatening, just irrelevant. Pretending requires energy, and no one was willing to spend energy on something that no longer fit. That lack of desire is the clearest ending there is. Endings don't always come when something is destroyed. They come when something is no longer wanted. The family didn't destroy the old dynamic. They outgrew it. And outgrowing doesn't leave room for nostalgia-driven reversals. You remember the past, but you don't try to relive it.
You understand why it existed and why it ended. Understanding replaces longing. This understanding shaped how the year closed. There was no sense of anticipation for a final reckoning, no expectation of a closing speech, no need for summary or explanation. The story had told itself through behavior. Everyone involved knew where they stood. And when everyone knows where they stand, there's nothing left to negotiate. The absence of negotiation is not coldness, it's clarity. This clarity didn't eliminate complexity. Emotions were still layered, feelings still existed, but they existed without the burden of expectation, without the demand to lead somewhere else. That freedom made the present livable. As the year approached its end, it was clear that the family wasn't holding its breath anymore. There was no sense of, let's see what happens next. What was happening next was already happening. Life. Unmanaged, unperformed, unpretended. And that is why this year mattered. Not because it changed everything overnight, but because it confirmed, slowly and steadily, that pretending had truly ended, and nothing rushed in to replace it. Because nothing needed to. By the time the year came to a close, nothing felt unfinished. That was the quiet proof that pretending had truly ended. There were no unresolved conversations waiting to happen, no emotional threads tugging at the present, no sense that something still needed to be said for life to move forward. What remained wasn't emptiness or avoidance, it was space. And space, when chosen, doesn't feel hollow. It feels breathable. The family moved through the final months without urgency. There was no countdown to a turning point, because the turning point had already passed. No anticipation of reconciliation, because reconciliation was no longer the goal. No fear that distance meant failure. Distance had become neutral. This neutrality was the most telling change of all. In earlier years, distance had felt dangerous, a sign that something was wrong, that effort was required, that the structure might collapse if people didn't re-engage. Now, distance simply existed. It wasn't interpreted, it wasn't managed, it didn't mean anything beyond what it was. That's what happens when pretending ends. Meaning stops being manufactured. Christine lived inside this reality with a steadiness that no longer drew attention to itself. Her choices didn't read as statements. Her boundaries didn't feel defensive. She wasn't proving independence or processing loss publicly. She was just living. That ordinariness of the victory, even if no one called it that, Ordinary life after years of emotional strain is extraordinary. It means the nervous system has settled. It means decisions aren't being made under pressure. It means the present doesn't need to be justified by a better future. Ordinary became enough. For Kody, the end of the year carried a different weight. Not explosive grief or dramatic reckoning, but recognition. The recognition that the family had reorganized around honesty, not endurance. That the center he once occupied no longer existed in the same way. That influence once assumed must now be earned and may not be offered again. This recognition didn't come with confrontation. It came with acceptance. Acceptance is often mistaken for agreement, but they're not the same. Acceptance simply means reality is acknowledged, and once reality is acknowledged, resistance loses momentum. The family wasn't resisting anymore. They weren't trying to change outcomes or reshape narratives. They weren't rehashing the past or forecasting a shared future. They were living where they were without apology. This is why the ending didn't feel dramatic. Drama thrives on denial. Without denial, there's nothing to escalate. Viewers could sense this as the story settled. The absence of cliffhangers wasn't a flaw, it was the point. The show wasn't building toward a final showdown, because the showdown had already happened, quietly, internally, and consistently. Consistency is the strongest ending there is. Week after week, behavior aligned with reality. Boundaries held, choices stayed chosen. No one doubled back, no one reopened doors. The lack of reversal confirmed the truth more clearly than any speech ever could. Pretending had ended and nothing rushed in to replace it. That's important. Often, when pretending ends, people fear what will fill the gap. Conflict, chaos, loneliness. But here, the gap filled with space. And space allowed for alignment. Alignment between values and actions, between capacity and commitment, between truth and behavior. That alignment made the ending sustainable. Sustainability is how you know something is real. If honesty had caused constant rupture, it wouldn't have lasted. If boundaries had created ongoing tension, they would have softened. If independence had produced isolation, it would have been abandoned.
None of that happened. Instead, life stabilized. Relationships simplified. Expectations clarified. Energy returned. The family didn't arrive at joy in every moment, but they arrived at peace often enough to know they wouldn't trade it back for performance. Performance had been the cost of pretending, and the cost was no longer worth paying. This final phase reframed everything that came before it. Past seasons didn't feel wasted, they felt explanatory. The pain had meaning now, not because it was justified, but because it led to clarity. Clarity doesn't erase pain, it contextualizes it. Context allows people to move forward without bitterness, to remember without reliving, to acknowledge without reopening. That balance defined the end of this year. The family wasn't celebrating an ending, they were inhabiting one. And inhabiting an ending is different from declaring it. It's quieter, it's less satisfying for spectacle, but it's far more honest. By the last days of the year, there was no sense of waiting for something else to happen, no unresolved tension lingering beneath the surface, no emotional suspense. Life had settled into a new shape, not better in every way, but truer. This was a year without pretending, and the absence of pretending didn't leave emptiness behind. It left space. Space for calm mornings, unremarkable afternoons, and decisions that didn't require consensus to stand. Space for people to be themselves without rehearsal. That space was the ending. Not a door slamming shut, a door no longer needed. And once a door is no longer needed, you don't miss it. You keep walking.